Hi there, welcome to A Little Wayward podcast coming out of St. Therese Institute of Faith and Mission. So today we're going to be continuing with our miniature series on discernment. This is part 3 of 3. Part 1 was talking about the various structures of discernment, reflecting an article by Robert Stackpole. Part 2 was talking about Ignatian attitudes or dispositions for
dispositions of heart that help us to really be open to make a good discernment process.
Exactly. And so what are we going to be talking about in this third part, Jim?
Oh, and today we're going to get into a few of the practicals, again, following some of the notions of Ignatian discernment, but recognizing that when we're speaking about discerning, we're discerning vocation and the 3 kinds of vocation. This was covered in the first section, but worth just going through again. Of course, there's the universal call to holiness, our call to holiness. That doesn't require a whole lot of discernment about whether we should respond or not, but the discernment of how do we respond to that.
To be holy or not to be holy, that is the question.
On the other end, the other kind of vocational discernment, which we so often think about, is about a stable and permanent state in life, married, ordained, consecrated life. And then the discernment that we're actually speaking about is to a vocation of what should I be doing? How do I best love, serve God? What is His preferential will for me? Because He does know what will bring me life, what will bring me joy, what will bring me to fulfillment in my humanity. Then how do I track that, discern that? In the micro and in the macro. So what am I doing this weekend, and what am I doing with this decade?
Basically, it's kind of just asking the question, what's the next best thing, Lord?
What's the next best thing?
And not even just like on the human level, of course, there's that consideration, but this is really like, Lord, where do you want me to go next? Because sometimes our human compass and the divine compass don't always align. And so it's just, as you say, finding that preferential will. Yeah.
Or as St. Therese might say, in living the vocation to love, a good question is, well, how do I love? Where do I best love next? And then being able to discern that. Loving God, loving my neighbor, and loving myself. Ignatian discernment would speak of 3 modes of discernment, or 3 situations or circumstances within which you would find yourself that help to lend some clarity for discernment. So the 3 modes. Mode 1, mode 2, mode 3. 3 modes.
Sounds common
the
sense.
way I like to describe them to the students are, oh yes, oh no, oh what? Mode 1 discernment is that sense of very great clarity. You know, you're looking at an option, you're balancing it, you are in discernment, but you are pretty clear. The movement of God and grace is pretty strong in the heart. You're feeling very confident about it. So there's clarity, there's peace, there's joy at the prospect. Discernment is not a very difficult thing. And really, if you find yourself in mode 1, good for you. Ride the wave, enjoy it. Write it down. I always encourage folks when they're in a time like this to journal the experience, because there will be times when it's going to be important to go back and say, God is faithful, and you do have moments like that, because more often than not, that's not the standard, typical mode to be in for discernment. But there is unique graces that God gives. I know one time that I experienced a very strong mode 1 discernment was in my decision to go on net. When I first heard about net, it was very clearly the next step in an ongoing process of searching and seeking and desiring to understand God's will in my relationship with Him and growing. And when it became clear, there just wasn't anything else to look at. It just, that was what I was doing. It was like the whole application process, the interviewing, everything was a formality. It might have been that I wouldn't have been accepted to go on net, but for me it was very clear that was what I was tracking. And if it didn't work out, well, we'd discern from there, but that's what I was doing.
It's funny, actually, when you say that, though, because when you looked back, did you ever think that was kind of curious? Of like, oh man, that was just so clear. How was that so clear? Because now you look back, and I'd say it's probably influenced quite a bit of your trajectory in life. But
well, certainly it has. I don't know that I've ever looked at it as something odd. I've always looked at it as very clearly a manifestation of God's grace and His accompaniment, which was good because it was at a time in my life where I really needed some hand-holding in those first steps into mature adult Christianity.
Yeah, something interesting for me is I've had a few moments like that. Most of the time I'm in the oh what or oh no, but there are a few very clear moments where like, yes, this is the next thing. And then you go in and you just don't really realize how significant it was until later. One of them was whenever I was living in Prince Edward Island with my wife Denise, we were discerning going over to Saskatchewan. After a certain point, it was just like actually when the first idea came, it was actually like very clear. Like, it was a very clear yes to go to Saskatchewan. Even as I was like, well, yes, but let's just try a few things around here first and see what happens. And then those things fell through, and it was like, okay, let's go. And then it's funny because that decision transported me into an interview at St. Therese Institute, which is very fascinating.
And the rest, as they say,
is history.
Is history. And speaking of St. Therese, I often say to the students when we're talking about mode 1, mode 2, mode 3 discernment is remember when you first heard about St. Therese. Was not your initial disposition of heart immediately and strongly this clarity, this yes, that's exactly what so speaking of mode 2 discernment.
Oh no.
Oh no. Actually, so often the experience that we have in these cases is a sense of conflict and confusion, a lack of peace. And it's not a disinclination. It's not like the clarity of, no, I'm not supposed to do this. It's just that sense of, really, this is what I'm supposed to do? You've got to be crazy, And that can be in the large and in the small. It's funny, when I heard about St. Therese, I will confess that Saskatchewan was, what? Really? Of the list of Canadian provinces to work on, Saskatchewan was not high on the list. I have changed my tune substantially since then. As I've fallen in love with the place, and especially fallen in love with the people of this province. Just beautiful, beautiful. But with my own background. So there's a little bit of that hesitance in the small, but mode 2 discernment is very much in the large. It's like you're looking at options and there's just this sense of deep conflict, deep inner conflict, in which case there's a need for more discernment, to bring more clarity, to really listen more deeply to the voice of God. In the terms of, was it 1 Kings 19 with Elijah going up the mountain? Mode 1 discernment is God appearing in the windstorm, in the fire, in the earthquake. Mode 2, mode 3 discernment means we need to listen to the small, gentle voice, and we have to learn how to listen very carefully. And that's where we have some techniques. Mode 3 discernment is that sense of, oh, what? There's just kind of almost a cluelessness, an ambivalence, a sense of, I'm just really not sure.
Yeah, where's the next move? And it's even hard seeing the moves in a sense. You might even have two options before you, and it's like, both of these seem, well, there you go. Yeah. That's kind of the reaction.
I often joke that my relationship with the Lord is like, which most people think is whatever, lose it. It's like, no, it's whatever, Lord. I think there's a bit of that ambivalence. It's mode 3 discernment. It's whatever, Lord. Whatever you want me to do. It's like, I'm not sure. I'll do it, but I just don't know. So the 3 modes of discernment. Oh, yes. Oh, no. What? So to be able to identify where you are. Again, if you're in the mode 1, that clarity, oh, yes, then excellent. Move forward with confidence, conviction, prayer. Continue discerning. That's important, so you know each step as you go. But you can move forward with confidence. The Lord is with you. And there'll be the signs and signals of grace. And peace is the first big one. As I say to the students too, it's looking for that deeper peace. The surface of the water may have the riffle and cat's paw caused by the wind, and it may be a little bit choppy. But if you go down about 15, 20 feet below the surface, is there a stillness there? That's the peace of heart we're looking for. So that can be, if you're in mode 2, mode 3, that sense of inner conflict or ambivalence and a lack of clarity, then the need for further discernment, learning to tune in and listen to God's voice. So with the dispositions of heart that we spoke about in the last session, which is that sense of openness and generosity and creativity and willingness, those psychological indicators of the little way that we've spoken about, of great generosity and the willingness to say, all right, Lord, speak. Then there's some practicals, some practical techniques. And we've got a list of, what is it now? 9 of them that I'll mention. And the first couple are not so much techniques, more than, all right, as I'm getting geared up into the actual nitty-gritty, the 4-wheel drive of discernment, have I got... Am I ready? Am I behind the wheel? Am I intentional? Am I pointed in the right direction? So the first thing is to get it together. And this seems like an incredibly obvious step, but it's the understanding that you cannot discern what you do not know.
Yeah, what's the shape of this thing? Yeah, that's kind of what it is. And I think this is actually one where a lot of people hear it and like, yeah, I've got it. But it's actually like, have you actually taken the time to actually describe the situation to yourself and describe your options? I know for myself, I get often kind of brought into a false sense of, oh yeah, I know exactly what's going on. Or often like I'm so confused that I don't even think to do this first step. And I keep trying to wrestle with the facts that I have in front of me. But I realize these are not even necessarily facts. Like, do I even know what's happening?
Yeah. And it's so simple. It's like if you are applying to university, if you're discerning about going to university, then have you actually gone onto the website, looked at the programs, found out what the application and admissions requirements are? Have you done the basic grunt work of gathering information? You're discerning what to do for this weekend. Have you actually sat down? You have an invitation to go somewhere. Have you actually spoken to the folks and found out what the shape of things? What are the expectations? It's amazing how so often we neglect this first step, and we're trying to discern something, but we don't have the basic ingredients. It's a bit like trying to make a cake without eggs and flour. It's not going to go so well.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And the other thing too is I think I have to appreciate the real grittiness of St. Ignatius's rules for discernment here, because sometimes when we think of discernment, we think of this deep spiritual introspection. And sure enough, there is a deep spiritual element, but it's not just about consulting one's deep emotional movements or even spiritual movements or sensitivities. It's actually using our reason too. It's actually being like, what can I see? What is in front of me? For example, like Oxford University for application sounds really great, and like, oh, that appeals to a desire, the image of it. But is that actually the program that actually is going to help you with your pursuit?
Right, we can romanticize things a little bit.
Yeah, and like, do they even have the program you want? There's another university which is less prestigious, but guess what? It has exactly what you need. And so there's those kinds of things that if you just don't scratch the surface with your reason, albeit an attendant reason to faith, you'll never know.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a simple thing like I'm thinking about work. Well, have I actually, part of getting it together is putting out applications, seeing what's available, reading the job descriptions, doing the work of pulling the information together. It's the understanding, as Aquinas said, as Augustine said, grace builds upon nature. In this case, discernment builds upon the material of the circumstances of life. So get it together. The second thing then, again, a blinding flash of the obvious, is once you've been gathering your information together, ponder it, bring it to mind, bring it to heart. You have to actually, as you were saying, it's not this very deep spiritual thing only. The intellect is a part of it. Reason is a part of it. So engage the brain.
It's like this curious balance between rationalism and mysticism. We're all called to be mystics, we're all called to be rational. And so there's this curious interplay of like your mind chewing on it and then consulting the heart and being like, Lord, what do you have to say about this? What is attenuating to my deeper desires here? Which ties into a previous podcast we had on that. And so like it's never just like, this is what I think is the most rational course of action for myself. Because how many traps can we end up that way? Like where we end up miserable, even though it's the quote unquote most rational course of action. I know for myself, I tended to plan 4 or 5 years in advance at one point. Then I went on a pilgrimage, and within 4 or 5 days of the pilgrimage, I was planning out what I was going to do after the pilgrimage. And then I realized this is insanity because I was just pushing all of what I was going to gain out of this pilgrimage into a little box, but that's not what the Lord wanted to teach me. So then even though my thinking was okay, it wasn't quite in tune with the faith. On the other hand, a faith not consulting rational thought risks being a little wispy and a little whimsical. Ethereal, not really grounded, kind of drifting from place to place.
And largely over-sentimentalized.
Overly sentimentalized,
And I think there's the grace of the Ignatian discernment principles, because it finds that very healthy and human balance of the emotional life, our thoughts, our feelings, our senses, but also with the intellect and reason. It's grounded in a beautiful way. It's about putting our hearts into our heads and our heads into our hearts, and approaching it as
this
a whole human.
Mutual dunking of each other.
Mutual dunking. Baptize the heart and the head, and the head and the heart. Anyway. And all led by the Spirit too, and that's a significant thing. So, gathering the information together, get it together, think, bring it to mind, bring it to heart, ponder the whole thing. Following Our Lady's example there, She pondered these things. The third one is to shift into neutral, and this is the challenging one. Shifting it into neutral, because we are all going to have natural preferences. Typically, we're going to have preferences, things that we would naturally opt towards. And to make a good discernment, it is to really put yourself in neutral. So I have to make sure that I'm not in drive, that I'm not in reverse, and I'm not in park. I have to be able to be moved as the Spirit moves me. A good example would be like being balanced on the roof of a house. With the wind blowing, it's going to move me one way or the other. But I'm in that place of neutralness, neutrality, waiting for the Spirit to move.
And there's cushions on either end, right?
There are cushions on either end, yeah. We're wearing the safety harness of grace, but just to be in neutral, be in balance. Now, does that mean that we are not allowed to have preferences? That's a question that often gets asked. Is it not holy if I do have a preference? No, I think, in fact, our Lord shows us that. One of the students was asking me that the other day, and I simply referred to the passion of our Lord, who himself made it very clear to his Father, Father, if it be your will, let this cup
pass me by.
And then he moved into neutral. But not my will, your will be done. So it's totally okay to be human and have human preferences. But it's to take those human preferences, acknowledge them, and say, I don't want them to influence my discernment. I recognize them, but I'm placing them to the side so the scales can be balanced.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. In fact, I think that this is what St. Ignatius means by holy indifference.
Holy indifference, yeah.
Yeah, and I mentioned that in a previous
That doesn't
session.
mean totally indifferent, because we are always choosing
I don't
God's
care
will.
what I do.
It means striving for holiness.
Yes, exactly. Indifferent to my will, but not indifferent to God's will.
And indifference does not mean apathy.
Of course, yeah. It doesn't mean being indecisive either. In fact, the whole point here is to reach a decision. It's a matter of holding maybe a healthy mistrust of ourselves in the process of trying to follow the true, the good, and the beautiful. And this is not always clear. What is a deeper desire and what is just a preference? And so that, I think, is part of this level of just surrendering this and allowing God to shine a deeper light into it.
Yeah. So the indifference is, again, acknowledging the human likes and dislikes, those kind of preferences. But in the intellect and in the will, I am indifferent to these different choices. So I am not, my will is not leaning to one or another.
You're not like passive-aggressively pushing one direction. Yeah.
Saying, Lord, I'll do your will, however, So.
But not that, please.
Not that, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so what's the next step there?
Okay, then again, a blinding flash of the obvious, step 4, and then we get into a little bit more of the practicals. So we're getting it together, we're pondering it, we're putting ourselves into neutral, and then pray. If this is really about doing God's will, then the whole process of discernment needs to be in the context of a lived personal relationship. So, Lord, what is your will? And help me to hear you. It's amazing how so often it is that expression of, listen, O Lord, your servant is speaking. Listen, O Lord, your servant is discerning, and I'm going to discern what your will is for me. And,
I'll do it, and don't you worry, And I like how you put it. You said it's the context of prayer. So like we say almost in number, like step 4 is prayer, but in a real sense, prayer, it's a step 4 that's permeating everything else.
Yeah, as much as these other, initial 4 stages are, it's like 4 corners or 4 posts, 4 foundation stones for the context of discernment. The getting the information together, thinking, being in neutral, and praying. It's not like do it in any particular, do it all at the same time, because this is going to be the foundation for some of the practicals for discernment.
Yeah, no, I think that makes tons of sense.
And so some of the practicals then, and these are things you can do one, do the other. There's no particular order to them. Sometimes I find when I'm in the process of discernment, there's one that one of these techniques, which is, or 2 are more natural to me, and I kind of default to, and others will just kind of come for the situation. It's like, in this circumstance, I may try this or I may try that. But one that I use a lot is this notion of try it on for size. Make a decision. A tentative, temporary decision.
Step 5.
And it's a very clear, little, almost childlike, humble thing of, for today, for the next 24-hour period, this is the decision that I've made.
Or even if it's like, it helps really much if it's like something on a daily, day-to-day basis that you can choose to do. You just try it and see what happens. If it's something like an occupation where you're just like, if you choose this, it's a career direction you've suddenly chosen, then there's the step of imagination, where you like imagine yourself in this job day to day to day. I'll share a personal experience. I started out in university in mathematics and sciences and stuff like that. I was studying math. I really loved math. And then all of a sudden I was like, I like math, but I imagined myself showing up to my desk day after day after day for a 30-year career. And I was like, is this something I want to do every day for 30 years? And the answer was a flat out no. Even as much as I find mathematics and logic very satisfying, and I still do, it just wasn't something I wanted to live my life around. Now, what I discovered over time is that my deeper desire for mathematics actually correlated really well to logic, and then also philosophy, the world of ideas, and then ultimately theology, the queen of the sciences. And so that's an interesting step where at a certain point I'm like, I'm still behind a desk, but I'm studying what I want.
Yeah. And interesting how a discernment process in that way, trying something on for size, wasn't like a flat no and a complete, but it was just a little redirect.
Yeah, exactly.
Into something, which is great. So this notion of trying it on for size too can be quite literally trying something on for size. Maybe it's actually, if you're thinking about working at a hospital, go and volunteer at the hospital.
Yeah, that's a common sense.
Go and check it out. And sometimes it's just seeing how the idea fits. So make a decision. I'm thinking about going to St. Therese. So
come and see.
Yeah, come and see. Or the try it on for size is today I've decided that yes, I'm going to St. Therese next year. And for the next 24 hours, that is my decision. And as you go through your day, just how does that decision feel?
Are you growing peaceful and peaceful and peaceful, or are you getting more and more and more anxious and concerned? And it's like, okay, then bring that into the previous step of prayer.
The next day, it might be 24 hours saying, all right, I'm going on net. The next one, it might be, okay, I'm going to university. And making those decisions over the course of a couple of days and see which one feels. And pay attention and then track that, write it down. Another one that I really like is what would you say to yourself if you were someone else? I sometimes have this.
That's super helpful.
I sometimes have this thing of, if I was a student coming into my office to talk to me about this problem, what would I say to myself? So, it's amazing that we seem to be so readily able to offer sage advice and counsel to others, but so difficult to offer it to ourselves. So. A little role playing in that way. All right, I'm sitting in the other chair having a conversation with myself. You don't want to look like Schmegel in the, I told him to go away and he went away. Not that kind of discernment process.
No.
But yeah, just the sense of what counsel would you offer?
Actually, that's one that's gotten me out of quite a few little conundrums. And it usually comes about mainly by someone I really respect or a spiritual director or someone like that. I'm like, I feel really bad about this, or I really am not sure about this. And it's like, well, Nick, what would you counsel someone else? They always use it against me. And it's always annoying because they're right.
The clarity that comes with that.
Yeah, the clarity. And then afterwards, it usually requires a bit of mercy on yourself. And also a bit of encouraging yourself, I love the scene from Get Smart, actually, of, the beginning of the film where, like, the secret agent, he's trying to try out for being a new level of secret agent instead of just, like, data analysis. And he's got all these sticky notes all over the place. And it's like, you can do it. You're the best. 42nd time is the charm, because he's tried, like, a ridiculous amount of times. And for me, I'm like, well, that's often, at this point, what I find. I would give someone else encouragement, and that's even a helpful practice. Yes, I have put a sticky note in the mirror in the morning, usually with a good Bible quote or something.
Oh, are we trying to be a secret agent? Or?
No. No, I can't even say if I was. So, the answer is no.
Yeah, so what would you tell yourself if you were someone else? What advice? And of course, you touch on an important point of do speak with people who actually can offer sage advice. That's a significant thing too. That's a very practical step is, seek the counsel of those who know you and love you and are in tune with the Holy Spirit.
And then, but in the end, the choice is yours.
Absolutely.
And that's a key distinction.
Yeah.
Because we can spend our lives constantly following the opinion of another. And there is a sense of being a good sheep and towards a good shepherd. But we can also defer responsibility.
Yep.
And that's the big one.
I would also encourage that in the advice that is being offered, if you're receiving advice from someone, to always watch for that element of, is your freedom as being an agent of decision in this respected? If somebody's putting undue pressure in any way, that should set off a few little alarm bells. There's of course good reason one way or another, but each person's individual agency needs to be respected. That's free will, and the free will needs to be respected. Another kind of mental game we can play with ourselves for trying on discernment is the notion of it's the end. All right, here I am at the end of my life, and I'm standing before the judgment seat of God. And the screenplay of my life is stretched out before me.
How would you feel about
this decision?
Yeah.
If I have done this, is this a good aspect of my life? Is this going to manifest the graces and gifts of the Holy Spirit to me in the lives of others? Did this bring God's glory? Those kind of questions. Sometimes that light of eternity can really bring things some clarity.
Do you have any advice who, in hearing that, may find themselves a little anxious and actually more confused at this step? Because I'm thinking of even those with a perfectionist tendency. Of being well, say you're discerning working at the church for the summer or something like that, versus working at a restaurant. One is clearly more of an ecclesial environment, one's clearly more of a secular environment. Permit me my little scenario for a second. But someone who has more of a perfectionist tendency might be there's more benefits for me spiritually if I work at the church, right? But that's not necessarily so. I mean, maybe the restaurant's precisely where you're going to be a witness to somebody. You don't, of course, go into that for that reason all the time. But maybe you're going to learn some key lessons about human life, But of course, if you're weighing just on that objective parameter, seeing the judgment, seeing your life from that perspective may cause anxiety. Do you have any advice or something like that?
I think that you're spot on. I think if somebody has a tendency towards perfectionism or scrupulosity, there's a danger in that. And I don't think that would be cause to ignore this step or this method, but have it within the context again of good spiritual direction. Good pastoral accompaniment with other people who know you and know you well. So use it as one tool among many. If it was one tool alone, and if the fruits that are coming from the exercise are fruits that are causing disquiet of heart, not the fruits of the Spirit, that should be a little bit of an alarm bell.
Sign of the
and
bad
then know
spirit,
yourself.
possibly.
Know thyself. If scrupulosity, perfectionism are challenges, and this technique is going to get you caught up in the midst of four-wheel drive discernment, you're going to be up to your axles in perfectionist mud, then avoid it. Right? You don't have to take these. These are just ideas. It can bring some help.
Okay, fair enough.
So that would be my thoughts. Another one that is very helpful is the Tcharts, and this is not one that is exclusive to Christian circles. This is just good decision making. I like to rather than saying a Tcharts, use a cross chart. So your T in the middle of a paper is just that. It's a cross. At the top, you want to be able to clarify the question that you're discerning and try to make the question clear. It's a single question, and it's a question about one option. And it needs to be narrow enough. Not too narrow, but narrow enough that it's focusing what your discernment at hand is. Write the question at the top of the page. Put the cross at the center of the discernment, because we want all of our decisions to go through the cross. On one hand, it's the pros. On the other hand, the cons. What is for this decision? What is against this decision? And then simply brainstorm. Brainstorm, brainstorm, brainstorm. And that can last as long or as short is comfortable. Sometimes a Tcharts is just a quick 10-minute, get the ideas out on the page. Maybe that's for a weekend decision, or what do I do next week? For a bigger decision, and in the discernment process, it may take a little bit more time. Part of personal prayer and in the context of journaling. And you get a sense of when the T-chart is done. But during this process, it's very important to not analyze or critique what's going on. It can be important stuff. It can be crazy stuff, like I'm going to miss my cat, if I go to college, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Write it down.
I think that's important because sometimes we can almost judge what our desires or our feelings are and then not write them down, but then they still haunt your decision in the background. And in fact, sometimes I find for myself, the craziest things happen if I don't write them down. Because I make the decision, and then in the moment it gets a little rough, I instantly think of that one thing I didn't write down. It's like, oh, I could have saved my cat, and it would have all been better. It was never a cat, but it was. It's usually something else. And so really, I think that, we write down our key moments, our beautiful moments on paper. I think we also, in a certain way, have to consign our demons to paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and because then we can see it, we can identify it, and then as soon as it's written down, you skim it. It's like, oh, you know what? That's a small desire. Like Mr. Snuffles can wait another year or something like that.
You can let that off. Yep.
But then there's another deeper desire of I've always wanted to be an artist or something like that, and here's art school, and it's just like, oh. Like this is corresponding to a deep desire. All of a sudden, big challenge, finances. Well, I mean, how serious a challenge is that? And is the Lord of my finances is the next question, and all that kind of stuff.
And you can see even just from what you're explaining, Nick, here, how one thought leads to another thought leads to another thought. And that same thing can happen with the crazy thoughts. You may have things which objectively, when you stand back and look at it, you might very easily dismiss it as inconsequential. And yet to put it down on paper and not analyze it may lead to another inconsequential matter, which may lead to another inconsequential matter, which may make the way of something that is actually significant in the decision process.
Which is strangely related to those two other things. So you actually learn a lot about yourself in the process. And it can be really quite entertaining as well.
So to do all of that, and when you're finished brainstorming into the T-chart, then you can actually say, all right, let's take a look and actually in the context of being neutral and wanting God's will, how substantial are these pros? How substantial are these cons? And you can start striking some things off. Strangely, what often happens is what was a pro shifts onto the con side. What was a con can shift onto a pro side as you reflect on it. But pretty soon there'll be the sifting, and then what you start to see is actually quite a lot of clarity. And it's amazing how not on paper, it can seem very confusing, but once on paper, you can see one list is often much longer,
weightier,
and deeper, weightier, and that can help.
Yeah, it's like the
balance.
image is like we've set it up on the T of a scale or something like that, and all of a sudden there's usually, not always, a very significant weight to the other side. Is there what have you found for yourself when maybe the scales are a little more equal? Have you ever done a T-chart and it's not been so clear even then?
Sure, that's going to happen. What I would suggest in a case like that is try it again in the context of these other techniques, but try a different question as well. You can be working on a few different T-charts at the same time, but each T-chart has its own question. So you may find that you've got, 3 different options that you're discerning about. Remember, discernment is always about 2 or more good. So maybe there's 3 things that you're discerning. So you've got it. We would be speaking to the students about things that would affect them. Do I apply for a second year at St. Therese? Do I apply for university? Do I go on net? Do I go into the workforce? There's some very clear options. So to be able to take those 4 questions, have 4 T-charts working. Some people would say work on one at a time. I see no particular difficulty with working on all 4 at the same time. It's not really multitasking. It's serial distraction. But to be able to actually reflect on these. So where you may have one T-chart which is kind of balanced like that, you may find that the obvious...
the other ones tend to clarify.
Yeah. So if you got one that is kind of evenly balanced, but you got 3 other choices that are very clear the cons are heavily weighted, well, that might all of a sudden make this a little bit more of, I need to look at that a little bit more closely. And maybe in light of these other T-charts, this one gains clarity. On the other hand, maybe there's a couple where the cons are very weighted, and there's another one that's very high in the pros, where this evenly balanced one is going to give way to that one. So thoughts that way.
Yeah. And I would even say that even if you have a chart sometimes where, there's 1 or 2 intense desires and intense pros, and actually more negatives in terms of number, but the pros are so strong and the cons seem strong, but maybe not as strong as just those two, for example. That's one where sometimes it's also not so clear. And from my experience, you actually step into those cons and be like, how much of a problem are these actually?
Yeah.
And then that's where you begin stepping into it. Or the con, or the pros. It's like, well, how weighty are these pros?
Yeah.
And then you begin, because you can often divide them down or realize, oh, actually, that's inconsequential, So, for example, one big thing, for example, university for our first years and second years discerning where to go is money, It's actually funny because in the spectrum of spiritual problems and physical problems, money is actually one of the least of the Lord's concerns. So, is that enough to stop you from applying to a particular place?
Right. And sometimes a T-chart can lead to another T-chart. So, for example, about that, if one of the cons about an option, for example, going to university is the finances, then maybe a T-chart about the finances. It might be an adapted T-chart, but actually sitting and saying, what are my options? What are, is it worth going into a little bit of student debt on this? Is there scholarships available? And going back, gathering the information. Seeking the advice of others.
Exactly.
Looking at the situation.
If some debt, how much debt?
Yep.
How much is crippling? How much is an investment?
And it can bring a lot of clarity to those pros and cons. And the other thing, too, is that some of the pros and cons may not actually be inconsequential. They might be quite of a concern, but maybe they're not deal breakers. It's the kind of thing like, okay, I could live without that for this years period, this 4-year period, whatever the term of commitment of this, it's not going to be the end of my world. Or as I like to sometimes say, it's not a salvation issue. Let's not turn it into one.
Let's not turn it into one, Great saying. So now the next step.
And then the last one that I would offer is, by all means, ask for a sign above, notwithstanding what I'd mentioned earlier about signs.
I was going to say, we just mentioned something about signs.
We did. We're not looking for God to make the decision for us, and unfortunately, all the time we approach signs that way. What we're looking for is just a signal grace of God's accompaniment with us, that He is in the mix. It's Jesus Emmanuel. I am with you. Those kind of graces of accompaniment, we can certainly ask for a sign of confirmation on a decision made. It's a little bit like, I have made a decision. I own the decision. It is an act of my will, and I'm just looking for an encouraging pat on the back and thumbs up from, the divine digits. It's that simple.
I think even for myself, there's been a few tough occasions of discernment, and then at the end of it all, it's like, Lord, I'm going to do this. I'm going to fill out that application. I'm going to go put in that job application. Still don't know if this is exactly what you want me to do, but you either don't hinder the process or put a very obvious block in my way. And I remember one time I applied to a microbrewery to work there. I worked there for a few months before moving to Saskatchewan. And it was crazy because I walk in the door, I give over a resume, and the guy's like, well, I might call you back. And then I'm like, oh, cool. You know this guy from this other place I worked. So we talked, and then it was like, oh, maybe I'll give you a call in 2 or 3 days. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, you know this guy too. And then by the end of the conversation, it had whittled down to, I'll call you in an hour after I consult with this guy. And it was funny because, that was just like a very strong sign of yes, and it was happening through the natural measure. But at the end of it, I was just like, I had a very strong sense of God's providence, and it actually worked out being one of the best work environments I'd ever worked. Other than, of course, St. Therese Institute, Anyways, I think it can happen through the supernatural, but also the natural, these natural signs.
And the signs are important. It's a sign of God's grace, God's accompaniment. But the greatest sign that God has given us for making discernment is the gift of our free will, the sign that we are able to love. And love is based on the freedom of the will. So the free will in these discernments is absolutely important. If we're looking for a sign because we're hesitant to make a decision, we're concerned about being wrong, making a mistake, there's a danger in that, because I think looking for God to make the decision for us is probably the biggest mistake there, because then we've not actually given our yes, which is so important. And this is an important thing to recognize too, is that God is not going to be afraid of us making a mistake, and we shouldn't be afraid of making a mistake. If we're doing it making a mistake, let's make it for all of the right reasons, and recognize that God is far bigger and His mercy is far greater than any mistake that we could be making, especially if we're making a mistake with the best of intentions of really desiring to do God's will. And God can always takes us where we're at and says, all right, we'll start from here. As Catherine Doherty says, with God, every moment is the moment of beginning again. Or as I like to say, God doesn't have a plan B. He just has an ever-shifting plan A.
And actually, it's interesting because, there's two mistakes we can fall into. There's the mistakes we can fall into on the path of trying to discern. There's also the mistake we can make of not stepping on the path. And so in the end, it's choose your mistake. And I think the parable of the 10 talents and the 5 talents and the 1 talent, comes into effect here. You know, if we never go in and invest, we're never going to know, and that's that.
Yeah, and you're actually never going to know 100%.
Yes.
In a discernment process that you're making, for the simple reason that if you did know 100%, there's no room for faith. There's always going to be that little margin of, Lord, I'm stepping out on this one. And I think our Lord is well pleased with that. So some final notions in the context of discernment is to recognize discernment is always an exciting adventure. It's this blinding flash that God's plans for me are always far more exciting than my plans for myself are. I think one need only dip into salvation history, dip into the Old Testament, into the Scriptures, into the Gospels, to see that God's plans are far more creative and far more interesting if we are willing to simply respond and go along.
Often a wild ride.
And maybe in light of that, something that Pope Francis has said in his recent letter on St. Joseph, and I thought this was profoundly beautiful. But so often in discernment, in many circumstances of our life, we're looking for some clarity. We're saying, God, why don't you just send a very clear and obvious answer? And Pope Francis, in reflecting on the infancy narratives, says we could very easily, in a superficial reading, think, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. Why didn't God choose an easier way? When in matter of fact, St. Joseph is God's answer in those circumstances. And so we realize the fact that I'm in the process of discerning may actually mean that I am God's solution in these circumstances in my life, and that He wants me to be engaged actively in the process of salvation history, being a co-creator with Him of these circumstances. So that's a beautiful notion. I think it's important to recognize that discerning God's will is not going to make for an easy life. We can't escape the cross. It's not going to be the gospel of prosperity that we're opting for in this. It's the cross. It's always going to involve the cross. And again, why it's so important that we make an exercise of the will.
Yeah, and there's someone actually from the history of the saints that I'm reminded of on this one. Saint Boniface, who was one of the big evangelizers of early Germany, the Germanic tribes and such. When he was actually going into Frisia and a few other areas, he was very, very depressed because it was very hard work and such, and he was suffering a lot. So he looked to the early church examples of the saints and such for some form of consolation. And he was dismayed to find that no one escaped the cross. And so he ended up writing back and forth with the Pope, Pope Gregory at that time, asking, what do I do? Am I allowed to come home or something? And then actually Pope Gregory was so impressed with his sanctity and his honesty that he actually renamed him bonifaceri, which is facer, pronunciation is not my strong suit, which means doer of good. And then he said, continue, you have my blessing and such. And what did St. Boniface continue to do? Well, he had quite a few dramatic incidents in his life.
Chopping down the sacred oak.
Yeah, chopping down the oak of Thor, where the punishment was less than savory for trying to do that. So there was a bunch of drama that suddenly happened in his life. And near the end, we had a peaceful and resolved soul. And he actually died a martyr, trying to go back into Frisia and evangelizing those who he left there. And so I think that the big thing is that, there is the cross and there is the crucible that we are all formed in these things. But not to be afraid of it because, there's always a resurrection. And we'd even begin to see the fruits of this in this life, if we have but the eyes to see, of course. And even on the natural level too. of character building and everything else. There's no easy way to something. There's only a simple way to something. Although sometimes it can be fairly light. So,
Cool.
yeah.
That's kind of it. In summary, just looking back over our 3 sessions, when it comes to discernment, do your best, give God the rest, to make a solid and prayerful discernment decision. Look at the decision prayerfully from all angles, gathering the information that you have. Take time. Beware of immediacy. That's a key thing. Urgency is very different from immediacy. Recognize Satan is the prince of immediacy. He doesn't want you to pray, doesn't want you to think, just needs
He wants you to make it now.
It's like Satan's a used car salesman. It's like, if you don't buy this vehicle now, this offer is only valid for you now. If you walk off the lot, that's not, at which point, what do you do?
Probably walk
off
away.
the lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, beware of immediacy. Take the time necessary to discern, even a short time. I think that's an important thing. Be patient. Be patient in the process. Be patient with God. Be patient with yourself. Trust the process, of course. Trust God. And finally, in the process of discernment, trust yourself.
Yeah. Because the Lord speaks through your desires and your heart, and you are given an intellect and will. He doesn't give us these things to fail us.
And what's the worst that could happen?
You fall in the right direction.
You fall in the right direction. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of a primer for decision making, for discernment and discerning God's will. The 3 sessions we've had. We work through this with the students. Certainly it's stuff that I live myself, clearly from the stories you've been saying. You live this yourself.
More or less perfection here or there.
More or less perfection.
Mostly less.
Yeah. So I hope that this has been a helpful thing for those who've been tuning in.
Yeah, and I guess we should probably close it off there. But yeah, I've personally found this conversation even helpful for me. Thank you, Jim, for all your wisdom. You've definitely been carrying the ball a lot on this one. But that's because you're speaking from presenting to the students several years in a row.
And very recently having just gone through it. So
yeah,
it's quite fresh. But
we try
thank you for the opportunity, Nick.
Yeah, no, it's been great. So thank you to all those who have tuned in to this episode of Little Wayward Podcast and this miniature series on discernment. Stay tuned for more coming out of St. Therese Institute. This has been Little Wayward Podcast, where we do little very well.
God bless you all.